Hi everybody, this is Francisco גיל-ווייט for ערוץ and Management of Reality and our joint programming. Remember, you can click on the CC button to get your subtitles in the language you want. Today I have Rabbi Pesach Wolichki, who is an internet force. He has an important podcast, and he is always discussing themes related to Judaism and to Israel and so forth. And today I'd like to ask him whether his views on the relationship between the U.S. government and Israel have changed with the latest news. Rabbi, thank you for joining us. I wanted to ask you first about the very latest developments. So we have that in Gaza, apparently, Hamas is going to be allowed to stay in power. This is the interpretation I give to this is they're being rewarded for October 7th. So would this make you lean towards the interpretation that the Trump administration is not really a friend of Israel and is perhaps a friend of the jihadis? Or how do you interpret what's going on with the new proposals for Gaza?
Look, when we agreed to this Trump 20-point plan back in September of last year, mid-September, I think it was, at the time, it was very clear that the calculation that Hamas had made, that if they hold Israeli hostages, they could eventually leverage them for their own survival, had worked. Meaning their calculation worked. We made that deal. Now, at the same time, if you go back and read that deal, and then you look at the framework agreement or the roadmap that was just published last week, which, as you said correctly, leaves Hamas in power, they are very different from each other. That 20-point agreement that Israel agreed to last year was, Hamas wasn't even a party to it if you read it. It was about Hamas. It was about disarming them and dislodging them and getting rid of them. And the Palestinian Authority was not allowed to have any dealings with this whatsoever. They would have to go through a serious period of reform. And there were all kinds of stipulations in there. There was a sequential order to how things would go. And the entire thing was designed to remove Hamas. And now we're at a point where this new framework agreement, or like I said, a roadmap that was published by the Board of Peace last week, kind of undoes the 20-point agreement without explicitly contradicting any particular clause. It kind of renders the whole thing irrelevant because it allows Hamas to remain in power. So, to jump from there to saying that the United States is become anti-Israel. Look, the United States is pro-America. And I think one of the big mistakes that we make on the pro-Israel side is we tend to be a little bit reductionist in, like if Trump does something we like, it's like half the pro-Israel community is like, oh, wow, the Messiah is coming and Trump is Cyrus the Great. And then when Trump does something that we don't like, we go, oh my gosh, he's betrayed us, he's turned on us, he's in bed with our enemies. I don't think either of them is a full reflection of the truth.
Okay, let's stress test that. But let's stress test that. So how is keeping Hamas in power in Gaza pro-America?
It's not pro-America, but it is giving in to certain allies that President Trump values and sees as important to keep happy. Meaning, I think that all of the mistakes that Trump is making in the Middle East, and this goes for how he's handling Iran as well, has to do with the very problematic friendships that this administration has with Turkey, with Pakistan, with Qatar, and primarily those three. But there's also other actors in the region who really don't have America's best interests or the West's best interests at heart at all. These are countries that are deeply in bed with the Chinese Communist Party, which is America's avowed adversary. But for some reason, the Trump administration has embraced these countries and gives into their pressure. The whole reason there was a ceasefire on April 8th after Epic Fury, as the Americans called it, or Roaring Lion, as the Israelis called it, was underway, and it was really pushing the Iranian regime to the brink. Israel was starting to hit IRGC sites. We were closer than ever to Israel's strategic goal of bringing down the Iranian regime, and everything ground to a halt because the Pakistanis and the Turks put a full court press on the Americans. And I think we're seeing a similar dynamic in Gaza. We're seeing a similar dynamic in Lebanon, where the Trump administration has been very wishy-washy about its approach to the Middle East because it's trying to satisfy the Pakistanis, the Qataris, and the Turks and their agendas, which are not in line with, they're certainly not in line with Israeli interests, but American interests. What are the American interests here is becoming a very foggy a situation. It's very hard to read.
Okay, so what would be wrong with a simple model that says, well, if the U.S. government is making sure that its jihadi friends are happy, because Qatar is a jihadi state, it's aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. Erdogan's Turkey is also aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. It has been a big supporter of jihadis. And Pakistan is a jihadi state. They're the creators with the CIA of the Mujahideen, and they've been supporting different Islamic groups against India, for example, and in other places. So these are all jihadi states. If the U.S. government is making sure that its jihadi friends are happy, why would it be wrong to say that the U.S. government has a pro-jihadi and therefore anti-Israel policy?
I guess it defaults to there. I'm not disagreeing with you that on those fronts it does. On the other hand, not everything that the United States does is against the Israeli interest. There's certainly actions that the U.S. has taken that have very much helped Israel. The weakening of Iran to the point that it is could not have happened without the United States involvement, and that's definitely been a net positive for Israel.
May I question that? Pesach, may I question that?
Sure.
Because it seems to me we really have to have a debate about this, and I'd like to do this in public with as many people as I can. It seems to me that the interventions of the U.S. government have been to save Iran, not to reduce Iran. So think about the 12-Day War. In the 12-Day War, the U.S. was not participating at the beginning. It was just Israel. Iran had no manner to defend itself from U.S. aerial attack. The entire Iranian airspace was undefended, basically, because they couldn't stop the Israeli planes, the jet fighters. So if Israel had continued, as you were pointing out earlier, the regime would have collapsed. What Trump did is he came into the war. He begged the Iranians to come to the negotiating table so that he could stop the Israelis. And he said that in public. And he said, and I quote him, "I want to save the Iranian empire," quote unquote. He said that in his own Truth Social social network. So he dropped a few. When that didn't happen, when the Iranian Ayatollahs couldn't come to their own political grammar, didn't allow them to come to the negotiating table and take a knee. So then what Trump did is he came into the war, dropped a few bombs so that he could take narrative control of the war, and then he imposed the ceasefire on the Israelis. So it seems to me that that's an example, and I can give you many others, but that's a very clear example of Trump coming in not to help Israel destroy the Iranian regime, but just the opposite. And you just gave me another example. You said in Epic Fury, it seemed like the regime was going to collapse under joint U.S. and Israeli attack. And right when it seemed they were going to wobble and fall, Trump declared a ceasefire, imposed a ceasefire on the Israelis, and then created another negotiation process, which everybody seems to agree was giving the Iranians everything they wanted. So what's wrong with saying the U.S. government has a pro-jihadi policy? What would it take for you to adopt that model? What would the U.S. have to do?
Well, again, I wouldn't. I think the United States is trying to play all sides. They're definitely. You're right. They definitely have been trying to save the Iranian regime, but I think that they've been trying to save the Iranian regime because of their pro-jihadi, because of their relationships with the aforementioned quote unquote allies, Turkey, Qatar, Pakistan, et al. I think that's why they're doing it, and maybe the reason why is immaterial to your point. The fact is that where the policies end up is definitely saving the Iranian regime. The Americans are stuck right now Trump laid out at the beginning of the war, he laid out objectives. Okay, and that if you go back to this 8-minute speech that Trump gave on February 28th, the day they launched the Iranian war, the war against Iran, Epic Fury, in that speech, he explicitly stated 4 objectives that were to destroy the Iranian Navy, to destroy their ballistic missile program, to destroy their nuclear program, and to destroy their ability to fund and to fund their proxy network, their proxy terrorist network across the region, across the world. And then towards the end of the speech, while he didn't state them as overt objectives, he talked about regime change. He talked about the Iranian people having the conditions being brought to their, to the table for them so that they could seize their government. He said, the hour of your freedom is at hand. It was very grandiose talk of liberating the Iranian people from the regime. And so that was if you listen to that speech and you say, okay, how is he going to achieve these objectives? What are these objectives? It sounded a whole lot like he's going to bring down the regime. Because look, there's no way to achieve those objectives, even the 4 explicit objectives. There's no way to achieve them without bringing down the regime anyway. And he was talking openly about it. And from that speech forward, probably a week or 2 later, he stopped talking about regime change and he pivoted and was talking, he started limiting, and then suddenly the objectives were limited to just Hormuz, opening Hormuz, and the nuclear program. So, to say that Trump has, in a premeditated way, a desire to be that he's pro-jihadi, I think it's more that he wants to satisfy these jihadi elements, and has hamstrung his policy so that it's now incoherent. When I say that that Israel is that he's done a lot of things that benefit Israel, look, if you go back to the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, where there was actually weapons blockades against Israel that were lifted when Trump came into office, that definitely helped Israel. The Trump policies Israel is better off with Trump in power than we would have been had, God forbid, Kamala Harris won. The dystopian reality we'd be living in with her in power would be way worse than this.
Okay, let me stress test that one. Let me stress.
I'm not giving Trump a pass, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that he's overtly and explicitly pro-jihadi. I think he's trying to play all sides, and again, the results end up being that he's saving the regime because he's so allergic to saying that he wants to take it down.
Okay, so let me stress test that one as well. So if we say that, it seems to me that if we say that Trump is giving the jihadis everything they want because he has jihadi friends, I don't see why we can't just say that he's pro-jihadi. I mean, if you have pro-jihadi friends and you want to satisfy what your jihadi friends want, you're pro-jihadi. How would that be different, for example, because I think the historical context is really important and we always have to take it into consideration. How would this be different from Ronald Reagan in the 1980s sending several $1 billion every year during the 1980s in armament to the Ayatollah Khomeini regime? I mean, that was violating U.S. law. It is potentially treason. I think it is treason. It's arming an enemy that says that wants to destroy the United States, a terrorist enemy. How is that not a pro-jihadi policy?
Again, I think you're right. I think it ends up being a pro-jihadi policy. I think that is where we are right now. But at the same time, I'm not gonna back down from saying that that Israel's security would have been in a worse situation had Trump not gotten elected.
Okay, well let's stress that one. Yeah. Let's stress test that one. Okay. So I remember that Biden was trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza, and he couldn't get Israel to do it. And Trump, when he was still president-elect, he hadn't been inaugurated yet, he managed to get Netanyahu to do the ceasefire that Biden couldn't get him to do. So my analysis of that is as follows. When the guy in the White House is represented as your enemy, which is the Biden case, then internal politics in Israel makes it easier to resist a policy initiative from the United States that is perceived to be against Israel's interest, particularly because the guy pushing it is supposed to be an enemy. But when the guy supposed to be your friend pushes the exact same policy, then he can get Israel to do it. and Trump did. Trump stopped Israel in Lebanon, saved Hezbollah. He stopped Israel in Syria and then installed ISIS. He installed the ISIS jihadis in Syria. He stopped Israel in Iran. He stopped Israel in Gaza. He grabbed Netanyahu by the ear and forced him to kneel before the Emir al-Thani of Qatar, the intellectual author of the October 7th massacre, and forced Netanyahu to apologize to the Emir of Qatar for defending himself from the Emir of Qatar. So it seems to me that the general picture is entirely pro-jihadi. What, if anything, in all of these policies that have been weakening the security of the Israeli state, is there anything that benefits America? How is this pro-America?
Again, it's only pro-America in that Trump is preserving his relationships with, he views his relationships with the Qataris, Pakistanis, and Turks as more important. But in terms of benefiting Israel, look, you talk about him stopping Israel in Gaza. Kind of yes, kind of no. Israel's been carrying out strikes, targeted strikes against Hamas guys on an almost daily basis for months now, and Trump has not said a word about it. He's turning a blind eye to it because, he doesn't want to. He stops Israel to a point. He hasn't tried to force Israel to withdraw from Lebanon prematurely. In fact, when the Lebanese demanded it, they refused to. This is just last week. They refused to back that demand. They've been. I wouldn't. Again, I think you're being reductionist here in that it's either anti-Israel or pro-Israel, and I don't think it's either. I think that there are many things that have hurt Israel here, and there are many things that Trump has done that have helped Israel here. And it's just kind of I don't want to. I think we make a mistake if we try to say, is Trump with us or not with us? I don't think it's either. I think Trump has some sense of what his own interests are, and sometimes they align with Israel's, and sometimes they don't. And we shouldn't be Pollyannish about it, but we also shouldn't be reductionist in saying that he's an enemy when there's a lot of things that have worked to our benefit.
Are we allowed to put the hypothesis on the table, though?
Sure, of course.
Okay, then give me the list of policies, of Trump policies, that you consider to be pro-Israel, in addition to the fact that he started sending some of the munitions that Biden had blocked. In addition to that, what do you consider pro-Israel in Trump's policies with respect to the wars that Israel has been fighting since October 7th, 2023?
Well, I think not pressuring Israel to pull out of the Syrian security buffer zone, not pressuring Israel to pull out of the Lebanese buffer zone, not only not pressuring them, but aiding Israel in negotiating a deal that gets the Lebanese government to be to comply with Israel's being there. I think those are very significant. And you say besides the weapons aren't a small thing. The weapons are significant. And what we've been able to do to weaken Iran, no matter, even if the Iranian regime remains in power at the end of this, which I don't think they will, even if the United States and Israel would stop everything, there's so much instability there now that I think that it's on the road to collapse. But weakening the Iranian regime and the way it has, the American support in doing that has been very important for Israel. Even if we're not getting everything we want right now, and we could always point to the cup being half empty, I think that what we've done to the Iranian network and the Iranian regime with the Americans' help has been very, very important. Again, I could also point to a whole slew of things that have undermined Israel. I think that's part of the era we live in with Trump, where I don't think I wouldn't categorize him as pro-Israel or anti-Israel.
Okay, can we distinguish between policies that are good for the cronies that govern the United States versus policies that are good for U.S. citizens? Because I can't think of how any friendship with the jihadis or policies to assist the jihadis who want to destroy the state of Israel in genocide, they're very clear about that. How do any of those policies actually benefit the U.S. citizen? It seems to me that any argument for benefit would have to be restricted to the U.S. power elite that Trump hangs out with. In other words, they have some interests that are, that are interests of the bosses, and maybe the bosses have some understanding with the jihadis, and they have joint goals that they want to achieve. But how is any of that? How is any pro-jihadi policy, now that especially now that the entire West is under jihadi attack? We are experiencing a Muslim invasion all over the West, and the jihadis are very clearly saying that they want to destroy us. So how are these pro-jihadi policies of Trump at all good for the U.S. citizen? It seems to me that there's no way.
There's no way they are. They're terrible for the U.S. citizen. They are the greatest betrayal of the American citizens. They're not quite as advanced as the betrayal of British citizens that the UK has engaged in, or the betrayal of German citizens and French citizens that those governments have engaged in with their policies vis-a-vis the Muslim world for the last couple decades. But it's approaching that, the American betrayal of the U.S. government's betrayal of its own citizens by being in bed with these people. It's unbelievable. Look, what would be in the greatest interest of the American people would be actually, ripping off the Band-Aid and taking down the Iranian regime and aiding and abetting the Iranian people to turn Iran into a pro-Western, free society that's democratic. They have the population to do it. They're an educated population. They're largely, at this point, a secular population. Most of the mosques in Iran have closed. 2/3 of the mosques in Iran have closed over the last 10 years because no one goes to them. It's a highly educated and industrious population. Could you imagine? You look at the landmass and population size of Iran, look at it on a map, and you realize that it's not just another Middle Eastern country. You add up the landmass and populations of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, all together, and you don't have the landmass and population size of Iran. It's massive. And if Iran were to become a free, open, democratic society, it would be the greatest boon to Western civilization and to the West and to the pushback against the jihadi takeover of the West, to have this massive Muslim republic fall and become a free country where Christianity can function freely. But it would also pose a grave threat to all of these despotic jihadist regimes like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and all of them, because the last thing they want is a free, open society that's that big and that powerful, an oil-producing, massive, highly educated population in the Middle East that is pro-Western. And therefore, that's why all these other countries, even though some of them are getting hit by missiles from Iran, are trying to save the Iranian regime. The last thing they want is it for it to become actually pro-Western. So I totally agree with you. It's a betrayal not only of the American people, but of the West that is under grave attack by jihadists, that the Trump administration is aiding and abetting the survival of the Iranian regime at this point. And that's why the Iran, look, American policy, Francisco, American policy right now looks extremely confused. On the one hand, it's talking about Iran as an adversary and talking about destroying this and destroying that and taking away, we're going to make sure that they're not nuclear. We're going to make sure the Strait of Hormuz is open. We're going to make sure they don't have a ballistic missile program. The only way to accomplish that is to take down the regime. But at the same time, the Americans are doing everything possible to try to save the regime while they're talking this talk. It's a very confused policy, and I think the whole world sees it at this point.
Okay, so I don't see a confused policy. I see a very consistent policy. Ronald Reagan did the same thing. I'm using him as an example, but in fact, they've been very consistent over the last half century. Ronald Reagan in public would say that Iran was his biggest enemy. In secret, he was sending billions of dollars a year in armament to the Ayatollah Khomeini. So I don't see anything new, and I don't see anything confused. What I see is a contradiction between the publicly stated goals and the actual policies, and that contradiction has been consistent. In other words, the US governments have been telling us for a half century that they are anti-jihadi. Meanwhile, all of the main jihadi movements that exist were created by the US government. The Mujahideen, which are now the Taliban governing Afghanistan, that was created by the CIA. ISIS came out of the US prison system in Iraq. And what's the other one? The Iranian jihadis are also a consequence of US policy. Carter got rid of the Shah and installed Khomeini in power, and then Reagan armed him to the teeth. And then they invaded Iraq, and gave Iraq basically to Iran. So I see a very consistent pro-jihadi policy, but also consistently claiming the opposite in public. Now, it seems like you don't have any trouble saying that the Trump administration is betraying the U.S. citizen. Why can't we also say plainly that the Trump administration is betraying Israel?
Oh, I wouldn't even call it betrayal. I just don't think that. I think calling it betrayal makes an assumption that at the outset they were supposed to be somehow committed to Israel. My argument is that, you know, our mistake is ever in having the conversation: is Trump pro-Israel or is Trump not pro-Israel? I don't think it's a relevant point. Trump is supposed to be pro-America, and if America's interests and Israel's interests line up, and I'm not talking about their true interests. I'm saying from if the president of the United States determines that U.S. interests are X and that happens to line up with Israel's interests, then we could say, okay, he's pro-Israel. But it's not pro-Israel as you know, by intent. It would just be pro-Israel by result. You know, the definition of allies are two nations that are pursuing their own self-interest, and those self-interests align with each other. That's what a real alliance is. That if I'm pursuing my self-interest and it advances your interests, then we're allies. So I think that's the best definition. It's the most realistic definition of an alliance. So when the United States pursues an action or a policy that advances Israeli interests, then we'll say it's pro-Israel. I think it's a mistake to talk about betrayal. I can only betray you if there was some commitment in advance. So I have no problem. Look, I see that some of the things that Trump has done have benefited us. Some of other things that he's done have hurt us. Right now, we're in a bit of a downturn in that. Listen, the big lesson of everything that's going on here, and here I think the two of us can absolutely agree, is that everything we've seen only underscores the need for Israel to be more independent, to be willing to act more independently. And indications are now, while I'm not satisfied with how independently the Israelis have acted, you know, I understand that there are constraints, but I think that we are moving in the direction of greater Israeli independence. Israel has ramped up its own military industry. It's been selling weapon systems and defense systems to numerous other countries and building out more of its own independent alliances. And as we see from the strikes going on in Gaza, Israel's refusal to budge in Lebanon and refusal to budge in Syria, we do see an Israel that is behaving more independently. And I think that there will come a point where Israel is going to be acting against Iran, against American wishes, and it's going to be an interesting moment diplomatically. But I agree with you. I don't agree with you to the extent that you see the motive here as being pro-jihadi. I think it's more. I would put it more nuanced than that. But at the same time, but I think we do agree that Israel at this point needs to break away from this, from tethering its policy to American policies.
Okay, would you be more inclined to say that U.S. policy is the destruction of Israel if Trump successfully pushes for Israel to get out of Lebanon, get out of Syria, and a Hamas government is successfully established in Gaza?
If that were the case, then yeah, I would definitely agree with you there. But I don't see them doing that. I don't see them pushing Israel. Again, like I said, just last week, when this latest round of talks between Israel and Lebanon took place in Rome, the Lebanese insisted on Israeli withdrawals in advance of verification of Hezbollah being cleaned out of certain areas. And the Americans pushed back and said, we will not be pressuring Israel to withdraw prematurely. And that was okay, good. You know, they're not pressuring Israel. And again, look at the Gaza Strip. You know, the other side has been screaming for months now about Israel violating the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip because Israel continues to carry out assassinations of Hamas terrorists there. And the Americans have not said a word about it. And you know, so there's, I think that the reality is somewhat nuanced, but I'm not gonna say that this administration is just flat out anti-Israel. I think that Israel is reaching the point where it's going to have to just publicly untether itself from American policy.
Interesting. It sounds to me, Pesach, like we are moving closer together. I'll be interested to keep watching the news in the days to come and maybe have another conversation with you and see whether we have moved closer together in our interpretations on the basis of what is going on. We have to end it here. I know you're a very busy man, but I hope you will honor us with a conversation again in the near future so that we can keep talking about this.
Yeah, let's do it. Listen, you could certainly turn out to be right, Francisco. I'm open to the possibility. More open than I've ever been. Let's just say that.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much. This is Francisco Gill-White for Arutz Tov and Management of Reality in our joint programming. Please remember to subscribe, to ding the bell, to share, and to give us a like because that helps us with the algorithms. I'll see you soon.
יש אירועים שפשוט אי אפשר לחוות דרך המסך. הנופש השנתי של ערוץ טוב יתקיים ב5-6 בנובמבר, כ"ה-כ"ו בחשוון, במלון נבל דוד בנתניה. יומיים של הרצאות, פאנלים ואנשים שמגיעים מכל הארץ כדי לחשוב, לשאול, להתווכח ולהכיר, במלון 5 כוכבים על בסיס פנסיון מלא. יהיו איתנו חוקר איראן אליהו יוסיאן, המזרחן יוני בן מנחם, מנהל ועורך התוכן של הערוץ טל ברקאי, תת אלוף במילואים אורן סולומון ועודד ניר. מי שהיה איתנו בנופשים הקודמים כבר יודע איזו חוויה מחכה לכם. מחיר מיוחד לחברי מועדון היחידה. מספר המקומות מוגבל.